problem that I was presented with, the problem of it doesn't work, can be seen in this history for Coremob Camera. The history here is very misleading. We have commits of cleanup, misc fix, but this issue, number 8, added a callback for canvas.toBlob async. So she told me that canvas.toBlob was returning undefined, and that was a problem. And I said, what's it supposed to return? She said, it's supposed to return a blob, and it was working. I said, okay, so show it to me. She showed it to me. And then we put a breakpoint in there next to that assignment here. And tried it again, and yeah, indeed, canvas.toBlob was returning undefined. In order to know what canvas.toBlob is supposed to do, we can look at the specification for the toBlob method of the canvas element defined in HTML5. So let's do that right now. What, WG, and multi-page. Always go for the multi-page. If you get stuck on the one that is all-in-one, it's going to freeze your browser. That's by design. That's quality assurance that is by design by Ian Hickson. He said that it shouldn't freeze the browser, and if it does, then the browsers need to get better. We had this discussion many years ago. There was a Bugzilla bug that was crashing the browser and bringing down the Mac, which is a problem I've been having recently as well. But anyway, all that aside, always go for the multi-page if you don't want to crash your browser or be waiting for quite a long time. Let's look at the canvas element. Okay, here it is. We're in the HTML5 spec, looking at the canvas element. This has pretty wide support, as you can see on the right-hand side browser compatibility chart. And this is section 4.12.4, the canvas element. This is the categories that this element falls into: flow content, phrasing content, etc. Context where it can be used, the embedded content is expected, the content model, transparent with no interactive content, descendants except for A elements, IMG with useMap, button elements, input elements. Okay. That's the content model of this. You can't have any stuff in there that you can interact with. Tag omission in text HTML. Neither tag is omissible. So that means you need a start tag and an end tag. It's not like a TR where you can leave off the closing tag, the end tag, or an IMG where the end tag is forbidden. It's more like a script element that requires both a start and an end tag. Content attributes. The content attributes are the attributes in the source code of the HTML. DOM interface. This is what we're concerned with when we're talking about the JavaScript aspect of the object, canvas object. We're going to look at the IDL, and the interface definition language also uses the term attribute, but in a different way. In IDL, attribute means a property for all intents and purposes. When we're talking about IDL attributes, that's going to be properties in JavaScript. Canvas.width is a JavaScript property, and IDL calls that an attribute. Now what we're really concerned with is this toBlob method. And we need to know what's it supposed to do, because it always returns undefined. So if we look at the IDL, we see this object, and to the left of it is the word void. Void means it doesn't return anything. It means it's a method that does something but doesn't return a value. In ECMAScript, any function which does not explicitly return a value has the return value undefined. Undefined is a value in ECMAScript. And that is exactly the value that we were getting in our example. Okay, so far so good. It's doing what it's supposed to do. So it looks like this method is actually working. The signature here, we have a file callback, first parameter, an optional DOM string type, and any arguments. And we already know that the DOM string type, at least Tomomi and I knew this from the toData URL, is going to be similar to the first parameter of toData URL. So we've got DOM string type here and any arguments, and we've got DOM string type here and any arguments. The only difference is really that we're taking the first parameter is going to be a file callback. And that looks like it's probably going to be a function callback here. It's got to be. So let's take a look at the steps from here. Whoops, the formal parameters are not listed here. Well, that's confusing. We can see them again if we go back, but then we have to jump back and forth. It'd be nice to have those there. If Canvas elements bitmap origin clean flag is set to false, throw a security error exception and abort these steps. That was not the case. It was not happening for us. Step number 2, let callback be the first argument. Okay. Step number 3, let arguments be the second and subsequent arguments to the method, if any. It means to this method. To the method means to this method. And we're talking about arguments here. There's a variable name in this algorithm called arguments, and they're referring to arguments being the conceptual idea of all the arguments that are passed to that function, and that's also represented in ECMAScript as an arguments object. So herein we have 3 meanings for the word arguments, and it can be a little bit more ambiguous than that, and we can see down below, we'll keep reading how this method is designed and defined in its behavior and algorithm. Step number 4, if the canvas element's bitmap has no pixels, either its horizontal or vertical dimension are 0, then let result be null. Okay, so is that the case? Maybe it will be, maybe it won't be. Didn't seem to be in our situation. We actually had a canvas with stuff on it. Otherwise, let result be a blob object representing a serialization of the canvas element's bitmap as a file. So this is a method here. A serialization of the canvas element's bitmap as a file is the name of a method. It's an internal method. They didn't feel like giving it a better name. Using arguments. So it's going to be a pass-through of the second through the last argument to a serialization of the canvas element's bitmap as a file method. Step number 5, return but continue running these steps in parallel. Well, that's really an out-of-order step. That means don't return here, but we're going to do something else. Now this is odd because now we have, if callback is null, abort these steps. This is odd for a couple of reasons. So this means that we're going to start a parallel, step number 6, and then step number 7, we're going to queue another parallel task to queue a task. So it looks like we have 2 parallel situations here. Perhaps the reason for this is so that this will abort silently, but I don't really understand why they did that. It looks just confusing. So step number 7 is queue a task to invoke the file callback with result. Remember, result is a blob object. The task source for this task is the canvas blob serialization task source. No references in this file. Great. Anyway, we pretty much know what we're going to do. We're going to pass it a function. It's going to serialize the canvas. When it's done, it's going to call that function that we passed it, and it's going to pass that function the blob that it got. Now, if we pass it something other than a function, all bets are off. If we pass it null, then absolutely nothing will happen. It'll fail silently. If we pass it anything other than null or a function, or anything callable, then what will probably happen is a type error will be thrown. If we were to pass it a string, then what should happen is it should go to step number 7 and try to call the callback, which in that case would be potentially a string, and in that case we would get a type error. We pass it undefined, we'll get a type error. We pass it null, we'll get nothing. Great. So this is a great place for anyone who is working on the core mobility web platform group to provide feedback. And I'd ask Tomomi to do that, to provide some feedback regarding the confusing nature of this method. And she did not do so, and I'm going to criticize her for not doing that, because that's something that was specified in the README. It was one of her duties, and it was not my duty to make the application work. It was her duty to make it work, and if making the application work was complicated by problems in the specification, which is something that she should have already known. She should have been intimately familiar with the specification before undertaking the task, then that would have been the time for her to do her job and provide feedback to the specification authors to say, hey, this toBlob method here, it's written in a way that's kind of confusing to me. I'd like it if you'd put the formal parameters in there, or if you'd make it a little easier for me to read somehow. It's kind of weird how they wrote it out. What do you guys think? So no, she didn't do that. So a little bit of criticism for that. I didn't do it because I'm not paid. It's not my job to do that. I was trying to help my wife get this thing to work. Okay, so we know what this is supposed to do, and now we know how to fix it. At that point, I knew how to fix this issue, so we tackled it right away. So we can still see this artifact here, var blob equals canvas.toBlob. Now, I don't know how that got back in there. I know that I talked to her after the fact, and for whatever reason, she wanted to keep it in there. But I thought we had taken it out, or that I had taken it out at one point or another. This is entirely misleading. This blob variable is going to remain undefined. And this is the blob variable that we care about right here. So when this function is called, the browser is going to serialize the canvas, get a blob, and then it's going to pass that blob here, and then we can assign it to data.photo. And then we can pass in the stuff that we were originally calling in a synchronous approach and wrap that stuff up in a function and then pass that function in, which is exactly what we did. That's our async branch in the if statement. Now in the if else statement, we have a synchronous branch remaining. The synchronous branch gets a data URL from the canvas, and then it tries to convert that data URL to a blob. If that is not possible, then what we'll do is simply keep the data URL. Okay? And we could have reused this variable here, data URL, instead of trying to invoke it again, but for whatever reason it's duplicated. And then the callback is called down below. So we can see that this callback function got added. And that is the call to get blob from canvas. Get blob from canvas, got photo info is the async callback that was added. That's our callback here, right there. Got photo info is a function that I created. And so I said that it wasn't entirely a handoff, but there were large portions of code that I actually wrote. And I didn't want it to be a situation where I wrote it and just gave it to her. There was a little bit of passivity where I really wanted to make this a team effort, and we worked on trying to get a balance. Anyway, I wrote this function. The blob failure looks like it's a new function that's being added to put photo in DB. This is a crucial thing to take note of here, because where is the redefinition of put photo in DB? Well, this exists in Coremob Camera IDB as a property. This put photo in DB is a property of Coremob Camera IDB. That's a method. And Coremob Camera IDB is defined in idb.js. Not here. It's not here. So that's not here. That's not in this commit. Okay. So it looks like there's something wrong here. It looks like we replaced a 2-parameter method with a 3-parameter method, but we don't see the method body anywhere in this commit. But we also see up above where we have this 3-parameter call. Looks like there were three arguments passed to it before, 2 arguments passed to it before, and now there's 3 arguments passed to it. So it's a little confusing, a bit uncertain looking at the history what actually happened. The history is messed up, totally messed up. So there you have it, the overview of the initial fix from getting it to something that actually can work from a design which was fundamentally broken and could not possibly work. There was change propagation from this across multiple files. I will, in another segment of this movie, explain what gotBlob from Canvas and gotPhotoInfo actually do, which that's a function I wrote which has 2 callback functions within it. And I'll also explain a little bit about how that integrates with the other file and how closures and scope management are passed to put Photo in DB.